Hello and thank you for taking the time to join in. We're going to make this basic preset here. It has a build-in and a build-out. We've published independent parameter controls for the in and the out. So for example, we can have it come back the way that it came. We can have it go out on the y-axis instead. We've got the option to fade in the first frames and fade out the last frames. We've got size control, and a good preset should have this in there. We've also got independent duration controls for the build-in and the build-out. This first lesson is not so much about the preset, but about the foundation for something like this. So we're going to look at a method that you can apply to lots of different templates that's useful for lots of different tools in Final Cut Pro. In this case, we're using it to do an animation preset, so we can consider this the first of the animation preset lessons that we'll be doing. Alright, so let's jump into Motion and get started. Okay, so I'm in a new effect project here. This project is 30 frames a second, it's 10 seconds long, 3840 by 2160, it's a 4K project here. So if you are new to making effects in general for Final Cut Pro, let's just cover the basic principle here first. When you open an effect template, you're going to be presented with this asset here. It's the effect source. So this represents the media in Final Cut Pro. A couple of things to note. You can't duplicate an effect source, and if you try and duplicate the group, you're going to find that you end up with a group but no effect source. Alright, so you can only have one of the base assets in a project at any time, but what you can do is you can clone an effect and you can clone an effect source. So something we'll talk about later on for another project. Okay, so the general principle is that by giving instructions to the effect source, they'll follow through and be represented in Final Cut Pro. So let's just grab the Y position of this effect source and we'll add an oscillate behavior, and let's just set that to 20 for speed, and I'll publish this. We'll go and have a look and see what happens in Final Cut. Okay, I'm here in Final Cut, I've got my media, I'm going to grab that effect that we just made and throw it on. So you can see the instructions that we give to the asset in the template will drive the media here in Final Cut Pro. Okay, let's get back to the project. Okay, so now we've seen how what we do in the template manages what happens in Final Cut Pro. What we want to consider now is a good way to drive those animations. We want a method that provides versatility and functionality in Final Cut Pro. The end user in Final Cut Pro is going to be working with different media of different sizes, and also what we want is give them a way for it to work in different aspect ratios as well, so when they're working on square or vertical projects for social media. Okay, so let's start getting this project set up. Right, the first thing we're going to do is get rid of this oscillate behavior. We don't need it, and because we are going to have a duration control for the in and out, we're going to set up some markers. So I'm just going to add a marker here, choose edit marker, build an optional, and I'm going to place that at 2 seconds, or the frame right after 2 seconds I prefer. We'll come down to the other end at -2 seconds here. I'm going to add a marker there, choose edit marker, build out optional. Alright. We've covered build in and build out markers many times, but if it's not something you're familiar with, the difference between mandatory, so you see we've got the option here, we can choose a mandatory or an optional build out. The difference is that when you choose optional, Motion's going to pre-populate these two checkboxes here. You can turn the build in or the build out phase, or both phases, on and off. These only work in Final Cut Pro. It's not going to work directly in Motion. Alright, from here we want to create our mechanism that's going to drive the effect source animations for us. Let's add a group, call it nulls. Into this group we're going to add a shape layer. I'm going to just use a square. The shape layer you use is completely arbitrary. We're just using it for its properties. Okay, let's reset that. I'm going to give it a color. I like to give null layers a color because it helps to tell them apart when they overlap, and especially when you have lots of different null layers working all together. Alright, so I'm going to call this null in and duplicate it and call this one null out and give it a different color. Okay. So null in, I'm going to move over here. Null out can go over here. Okay, now let's grab the effect source. Grab the position. Add a link. Call this link null in. And we'll add null in layer as the source. Okay, so we've linked the position of the effect layer to the position of null in. If we turn that off, you can see what's happening there. Right, let's duplicate null in link, drop it under, and call it null out, and use the null out layer as the source this time. From here, let's see what happens when we turn off the null in. The null out is going to assume control. Alright, so a general principle of behaviors in motion is the behavior that is sitting first in the layers panel is going to override and dominate all the behaviors that come after it. So you probably recognize this from other lessons I've done. I use this principle a lot, and I've built entire plugins on this method here as well. So the important thing here is this custom mix slider. If we turn this behavior on and off, we can get the same result, moving the mix from 1 active to 0 inactive. And this is the principle we're going to use to animate the effect. Alright, so from here all we need to do is decide what to publish and figure out how we're going to put animation controls into this effect preset, because you see we're only using links so far. We need something to regulate the duration of the in and the out. Alright, from here we want to find our links in this layers panel, so there they are. Now I'm going to come to halfway in the project. This is 10-second duration at 30 frames a second, so there's halfway, and I'm going to trim null in to end here, come 1 frame forward, grab null out and trim that to begin here. At this juncture, the links will swap control. Alright, so to animate our links and provide some duration control, we're going to use the ramp behavior. Select the null in. Alright, grab the custom mix and add a ramp. And I'm going to trim that ramp to the same endpoint as the null in link. Okay, just going to call this ramp in. Okay, so how do we want to configure our ramp behavior? By default, without the ramp applied, our start value, the value where the link has control, is 1. Alright, so we want to move from a value of 1 to a value of 0. Okay, in the ramp behavior, we're going to set that with the end value. So we want an end value of -1. Okay, so now in the link, you can see that at the end of the ramp, we have in the null in a 0 value there. Okay, cool. So now I'm going to duplicate the ramp in. Call that ramp out, and we're going to change the assignment from behaviors null in custom mix to behaviors null out custom mix. And we want this to work the other way around. So we're going to want the start value to be -1 and the end value to be 0. And we're going to move that ramp behavior to the end of the project so that it lines up with the null out link. Okay, so now we have an animation in, and the null out takes control for the animation out. Okay, so from here we want to provide some limits to the duration frames in and out. Okay, so right now the animation for the ramp in and the animation for the ramp out consume all the frames available for the length of the behavior. So the ramp in is going for 5 seconds and the ramp out is going for 5 seconds as well. So this is a 10-second project. It's 300 frames at 30 frames a second. So the ramp in has 150 frames and the ramp out has 150 frames. What we're going to do to regulate the duration is put the end offset of the ramp in and the start offset of the ramp out onto a slider widget. But before we do that, let's jump into Final Cut Pro so I can give you some more detail on how this method works. Alright, let's use these graphics here to demonstrate what happens in Final Cut Pro when we put the offsets, the start or the end or both, onto a slider in the motion template and then publish that slider to use in Final Cut Pro. So on this side we've got the ramp in. Over here we have the ramp out. Note the white line. The white line represents the last frame of the animation. Over here it represents the first frame of the animation. Alright, so in our template we know these behaviors meet right in the middle, but for demonstration's sake here I have them separated. Okay, so this bar is running on a ramp in and a ramp out. It's just animating by scale. So right now it's going to take the full 5 seconds in and the full 5 seconds back out again. Okay, so let's look at the ramp in, where we are going to, in the template, we're going to put the end offset onto a slider and then publish the slider. Okay, so this is what we'll have. It'll be called something different in our project, but when we increase the end offset value, see the white line here is moving back. So what we can see is that increasing the end offset makes the animation finish earlier in the timeline. In this case, if we set the offset to 50, then that leaves us with, the full duration of 150 minus 50 frames, counting backwards from the last frame or the out point of the behavior in the project. So 150 minus 50 gives us 100 frames to run. If we want to have a maximum duration in our template of 2 seconds, we're going to want to put a value of 90 in our widget, which we'll do soon. So then 150 minus 90 gives us 60 frames maximum to run. Let's have a quick check. Okay, so we see now the bar finishes the animation right on 2 seconds there. Okay, now looking at the start offset, again, the ramp out behavior lasts for 5 seconds, 150 frames. When we increase the start offset value, you see that we are subtracting frames for the maximum duration, but we are working forward from the in point. For an animation out, the start offset makes the start of the animation happen later in the timeline. So for a ramp in or a parameter behavior in, when we put it onto a slider, is going to cause the animation to finish earlier. With a start offset, it makes the animation begin later. Alright, and likewise, we're going to have a value of 90. So let's have a quick check of the animation out. So you see it's going to start right on the 2-second mark, and then the last frame of the animation is going to be the last frame of the template. And this is very important. There are some tutorials out there that forget this step. They forget the difference between the end offset for a build in and changing to the start offset for a build out. Now, if you are making an effect with the ramp to drive the animation, that's not a good thing to do, because what you'll see, if we have the end offset on the ramp out, then the behavior is going to finish before the actual media layer that the effect is applied to, and that's a bit of a nightmare for editors to work with. Alright, now that we see what's happening, let's jump into the project and continue. Okay, let's get the start and end offsets of our behaviors onto sliders that we can then publish for use in Final Cut Pro. The first thing we want to do though is set the curvature on each behavior to 100. That gives us an ease in, ease out animation speed curve. Now we're using ramp for this lesson. When we do depend on the ramp behavior, we are locked into that one speed option, the ease in and the ease out. It is possible in Motion to create a mechanism where you can have duration controls and custom speed selections, but we will cover that in another lesson at another time. Okay, let's grab the end offset of the ramp in and choose Add to Rig, New Rig, Add to New Slider. I'm going to call the new rig here Duration, and this slider Duration in. Okay, so following what we saw there in Final Cut Pro, if we want to have no animation, we will have the last frame of the animation be set to the first frame of the behavior. In this case, we would want the end offset then to be 150. At our maximum, we want the animation to run for 2 seconds. So we need an end offset of 90, leaving 60 frames to run the animation. Note that the maximum range for a slider is at 100 by default. That's not very intuitive compared to the duration environment we want to create for Final Cut Pro. So we're going to change the maximum range here to be 2 seconds. Okay, let's do a quick check here. We're sitting at the maximum here of 2. So the animation is finishing at 2 seconds here. When we set the duration to 0, the animation is basically ending on the same frame it starts, so we have no animation at all. Okay, I am going to select now the duration rig. I'm going to add a slider. We'll call this one Duration Out. I'll just drop it under. Okay, now I'm going to grab the ramp out and I'm going to grab the start offset and drag that to duration out. Okay, and we'll just do the same here. At 0 we want a value of 150, and at 2 we want a value of 90. So at the maximum, the animation is going to begin right on 2 seconds. And at the minimum, the animation is starting on the last frame available, so we get no animation at all. From here, let's grab duration in and publish that, and do the same for duration out. Grab the null in layer, and now we're in a 3840 by 2160 project here. So if we want by default the effect source to start right off screen, we are going to set this null layer at -3840. We'll just reset the slider back to the maximum range. Okay. And then likewise, if we want the animation out by default to animate off screen the other way, we'll set this null behavior to +3840. Sometimes in a template, when you have the exact parameters, the very edge of the asset layer of the media will show at the side of the project. So depending on your edit, that's going to be a problem. So let's actually send it a few pixels further. So let's go for 3842 and -3842 for the in. Okay, now I'm going to grab the null in and publish that, and grab the null out and publish that as well. So now in our published parameters, we're going to call this whatever you like. I'm going to call this, let's say, range in and range out. So now we have independent duration control for the duration in and for the duration out, and independent parameter control to choose the direction of your animation in and out also. Okay, if you're ever working in motion and you see that these arrows don't collapse as you would expect them to, that generally means that somewhere in your layers you have left a property parameter set open. So if we close that, you'll get the normal function. It's not really an issue, but sometimes you will see that if that state is happening in your published parameters, then you will get, as you publish, this will be open by default. Not really a big issue. It's just a matter of aesthetics really in the template, but if you've ever come across that, now you know what to do about it. Now that we've set up the duration in and out and parameter control for the in and out, let's have a look at what not to do, and I'll explain better that mistake I mentioned when we were looking at how the offsets work in Final Cut Pro, when you don't swap to the start offset for the animation out behavior. Okay, just to illustrate this common mistake, I've gone back to square one, just starting over with the effect source. If you've been following along, don't go back to square one, just leave your template as it is. I'm just doing this to prove a point. Alright, so I'm going to grab now the X position of the effect, and I'm going to add a ramp directly to that. We'll set the start value at -3840 and crank up the curvature. Okay, now in this case, because we're not going to use links, we can just have the ramp trimmed to 2 seconds, which is what we want our maximum duration to be. So remember, in a 30 frames a second project, 2 seconds is 60 frames. So we have the same default animation as before. Now we're going to grab the end offset, add that to a rig, new slider. Okay, and we'll call this duration. Now because our behavior is only 2 seconds long, 60 frames, to have no animation at all, we want a value of 60. And at the maximum, it'll have a value of 0. So at the maximum, the behavior ends on the last frame of the behavior or the out point, and at a value of 0, the behavior ends on the first frame of the behavior, or the endpoint. We'll just add the same range value here as well. Okay, so that is our behavior in. Okay, this is all good so far, but this is where things can go wrong, and this is a common mistake I see across many YouTube tutorials trying to demonstrate duration controls with the ramp behavior. So let's put that right. I'm going to duplicate the ramp in. I'll just drop that under the original. And I'm going to call this the ramp out, and I'm going to move that behavior up to the other end. Ramp in, ramp out. Okay, now we want to change the values around here. So we want the start value to be 0, and the end value now we'll set to 3840. So we get the same default animation as before. In from the left and out towards the right. But what's happened here is that in duplicating the ramp, it's a nice feature of motion that when you have rigged parameters, duplicating the parameter will automatically populate it to the same rig. But what we have right now is not good. Our ramp out behavior has the end offset assigned to the slider, and this causes a problem. So if we, for example, have half duration at 1 second, can you see what's happening down here now? These are the animation curves for the behaviors. At 1 second out, because the end offset has been applied and not the start offset, the last frame of the animation happens before the last frame of the template. Let's have a look at the results of this in Final Cut Pro. Okay, in Final Cut I have applied the wrong method effect to this media. So the animation in is working fine, but with the duration at 1 second, the animation out is going to happen too soon. See how the last frame of the animation happens before the end of the media? And for editors, this is going to become frustrating, especially if you've created a whole bunch of effect presets with the wrong offset applied to the ramp out. So, at 2 seconds it will appear to work normally. But between the minimum and the maximum, we have poor functionality, the wrong functionality that you should have working in your effect presets. Alright, let's go back to the project and correct this mistake. Alright, so how do we correct this? First we need to remove the ramp out from this slider. So select the parameter and choose remove from widget. Okay, now we're going to grab the rig and add a new slider. We'll call this one duration out, rename this one as duration in. Okay, and from here we're going to grab the ramp out and put the start offset onto that slider and set everything up the same way as before. 60 frames offset for the minimum, and at the maximum, no offset. So now our behavior out, when we have a value between the minimum and maximum, the animation's always going to finish correctly on the last frame. So we're not giving the end user of the effect template a headache in Final Cut Pro. What we just did is create an independent duration in and out. But if you're working on a template where the specifications are that there is just one slider for the in and out duration, I'm going to remove the duration out slider and remove the ramp out as well. So we're back to square one. I have a ramp in and the end offset is on the duration slider. Alright, so that is now just one slider for duration. Again, we're going to duplicate. Note that when you duplicate behaviors, in the layers panel there's a quirk in motion where the order won't be correct until you click out and click back in. Okay, so now we have the duplicate in the right order. We want to reset these values, so 0 here and 3840 here. Okay, I'm going to put the behavior to the end of the project. So now we have the in and out on one slider, but we're back to this same problem. So all we need to do from here is just remove the end offset for the out ramp behavior, grab the ramp out, and drag in the start offset instead. Okay, so we'll now configure this with the values of 60 at the minimum and 0 for the maximum. And that's how to set up a single slider for duration in and out if you're using the ramp behavior. Quick check, if we have a value between the minimum and the maximum, our out animation is ending correctly on the last frame of the template. Okay, all of this was just to reveal and highlight a common mistake that I see repeated in many YouTube channels that deal with motion. Let's get back to our regular project and continue. Alright, so what other features and functions do we want to provide for the end user in Final Cut Pro? Let's add a size control. Come to the effect source, grab the Y scale, and apply the effect source as the link source, and link the Y scale to scale X. I'll just rename this Y to X. So if you've seen other lessons I've done on this channel, you know that I prefer this method because it allows us just to publish a single slider, the X scale, without having to have Y and Z there, because the Y and Z are redundant. So here we are, just a single slider to control the scale, and we can call it size. Next, we want to provide a way to fade in and fade out the animation. Because we're providing full range control for the animation, if the end user wants the animation to begin on screen rather than come in off screen, then we need a fade option here. Otherwise, the media will just slam into view and snap out of view on the way out. We could use the basic motion fade in, fade out behavior, but that behavior provides a very blunt and harsh animation for the opacity. We want something that is graduated, and to do that we're going to use nulls again. I'm going to grab this group here and just add another one above it, and this will be the fade null. I'll add any shape layer here. Generally, when you're using a null layer, the layer itself is arbitrary. We just want to use it to link properties, that's all. I'll just center that, give it a color, and I'm going to call this fade null. I'll come to properties and on the first frame set the animation to 0, add a keyframe, and I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 frames in, set that opacity to 100, and grab the curve in the editor and create a graduated fade in, something that starts off slow and then accelerates. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, that will do. I'm going to copy these keyframes, come to the end of the project, come back 6 frames, 7 actually, set a keyframe there and paste those keyframes and choose reverse keyframes. So here's our graduated opacity fade in, and at the end we have a graduated opacity fade out. Okay, from here grab the effect source, add a link to the opacity. Trim that link to the midpoint of the project, in this case 4 seconds 0.29. I'm going to call this fade in and drag in the fade null as the source. So our media is fading in. Now if I turn the mix of this link off, the media will not fade in. Okay, so I'm going to put this mix onto a checkbox. So add to rig, new checkbox. And we'll call this fade in. So when it's deselected, the link is off. When it is active, the link is on. We set the value of the mix to 1. So quick check, active, and off. Okay, so now we're going to duplicate that link and call it fade out. And move that link to the end of the project. Now this is a case where duplicating the behavior will populate again to the same checkbox. So we want to come to our fade in and just remove that. I'm going to grab the rig, add another checkbox and call this fade out. Grab the fade out link, custom mix, drag it to the fade out checkbox. So when it's active, it's at 1. When it's not active, it's at 0. Okay, quick check. It's not active. The media is not fading out. It is active. The media is fading out there. Alright, let's publish, fade in, and fade out. So now we have duration in, duration out, range in, range out, size, fade in, and fade out. We could even add rotation as well. Let's leave it as it is for now. Now we want to turn off these null groups so that the null layers are not visible in Final Cut Pro. Okay, so from here we have a few published parameters now. So let's look at organizing these into sections. Okay, I'll just turn off the fade out, so the fade in and out are off by default. Now I'm going to come to my library, into my favorites, into the row E49 favorites, and I'm going to drag in here my sections. There's a link in the description to the lesson where I cover how to create this pre-populated set of widgets that provide us with section breakers. So if you go and check that out, you'll learn how to prepare these widgets and put them in your library to use for any other project. Okay, I'm going to rename, from here, let's just rename this one as animation. This one can be controls. Let's call this one fade. And this one we can call, oh, that might be enough. Let's publish animation, publish controls, publish fade, and see if we need anything after that. I'm going to put animation at the top. Aha, yes, we want duration as well. Duration, we can put range in, range out, and size in the control section, and of course fade for fade in, fade out. That's how I would group the parameters for something like this. You can set them up any way you like. And with that, we have finished our basic animation preset made in motion for use directly in Final Cut Pro. Publish your effect, take it for a spin in Final Cut. If you have any questions or issues, leave a comment and I will get back to you as soon as I can with the help that you need. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next one.